Okay.
So Catherine, I could hear I could hear somebody just then.
That was me, and I just muted. I realised I'm muting myself.
Okay, I'm not going to start the webinar for another minute or so, so we're all okay. Okay, everyone, I'm going to turn my video on and I'm going to start the webinar, but I will leave it until just after o'clock before we actually start talking, okay? Welcome, everybody. We're just letting people join before we start. Welcome to all those joining. We're just going to leave it a moment or so longer before we start, just to make sure everyone's had a chance to join. So welcome everyone to the next in our series of EIDA Insight Hours. These are our 1 hour online webinars. They're open to all of EIDA's members and your employees. Today, in a moment, I'll be delighted to be joined by Dr. Nicola Sharp-Jeffs and Dr. Catherine Royal, both from Surviving Economic Abuse, to talk about their latest report on economic abuse seen yet sidelined, and to hear about how employers can play a critical role in recognising and responding to economic abuse. A few points before we start. First of all, this session is being recorded so that we can make it available afterwards for people not able to attend or who wish to view it again, and it will be available on our website. Secondly, the chat function is open, so please feel free to share your reflections in the chat. And also there will be an opportunity to ask questions. There is a Q&A box. Please start adding your questions as we go, and we'll turn to those a little bit later on in the session. Finally, just to say that we will be sharing some experiences from victims and survivors of economic abuse during the course of this session, and some of them are very distressing. So we want people to be aware of that. So please feel free to step away if you need to. We're going to start by sharing a video from one of the victim survivors of economic abuse who was involved in the report led by Nick and Catherine. Really important just to share as we start that voice of the victim and survivor, and then I will introduce you to Nick and Catherine and their presentation. So could we now play the video, please?
Hello there. Economic abuse is a form of domestic abuse, and you might not realise it, but it can be every bit as devastating. It doesn't just restrict your access to your finances, it strips your independence, your dignity, and ultimately your ability to get out. And that's exactly what happened to me. My name is Ruth Dodsworth, and I've been a television presenter for over 26 years. 20 years of that time I was living in an abusive marriage. 2 years ago, my now ex-husband was jailed for coercive controlling behaviour and stalking. As part of his coercive controlling behaviour, he took away any access I had to my own money, my bank account, my bank card. Now you might be thinking, well, how could you allow that to happen? Well, you do, because the minute you ask, it invariably puts your life in danger, because it could trigger a fight or an argument. So I learned to make it my normal. I learned not to ask. If I wanted money, I asked him. If I wanted food, I asked him. If I wanted to buy clothes for the children, I had to ask him. It's a very difficult thing to admit to, but actually it kept me firmly under his control, because I think from his point of view, if I had access to money, I had access to the outside world, access to other people, and the possibility of getting out of our marriage, and that's not what he wanted. I was his possession. Now, yes, he's been to prison, but the ramifications, the ripple effect is huge. He took out loans and cards in my name, which I am having to pay off. I don't have money. All my savings, everything is gone. My credit rating is destroyed. I'm only able to rent a home because my elderly parents are acting as guarantors. So these effects are going to be lifelong, and it's difficult, and it is a struggle financially, but actually I'm alive and well and able to tell you my story. So yes, we need to recognise economic abuse. We need to talk about it. Money is not a nice thing to talk about by any means, but neither is talking about abuse. So it could save someone's life. Let's keep this conversation going, and thank you so very much indeed just for listening.
Susan, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. Massive thanks, I was saying, to Ruth for being willing to share her story with all of us today. Just like to invite Nick and Catherine to turn on their videos and to join me. Welcome, both of you. So it's a real pleasure and privilege to be joined by Nick and Catherine today. And just to introduce both of them from Surviving Economic Abuse. So Nicola Sharp-Jeffs is the founder and CEO of Surviving Economic Abuse, which is a charity. And Nick has campaigned tirelessly over many, many years to raise awareness about the impact of economic abuse and to bring about really critical change to the legislative landscape here in the UK. Massive thanks, Nick, for everything that you've done over many, many years. Nick also works alongside domestic abuse charities to support employers in understanding the scope of economic abuse and what they can do, and really critically works with many financial institutions, banks and building societies to support them in how they support their vulnerable customers who are impacted by domestic abuse. And then also Dr. Catherine Royal, who's a research officer at Surviving Economic Abuse and has been intimately involved in working on this report, which we're going to share today. So Catherine completed her PhD on sexual violence and the media at the Centre for Research into Violence and Abuse at Durham University. And she also has extensive experience of supporting victims and survivors of domestic abuse. So welcome both of you, great to see you. We're going to start off with a short presentation about the report, and I will turn off my video while you do that, and then I'll come back for some questions. Thank you both.
Thanks, Susan, and thank you so much for having us. It's the support of organisations like yourselves and those across both the financial services and violence against women and girls sector that have enabled us as a young charity to have so much traction in such a short period of time, and we're hugely appreciative of it. And thank you for all employers joining today and perhaps giving up some of your lunch hour to hear about our research. So the research report is called Yet Sidelined. That title actually came from Ruth, who felt that through her experience of the criminal justice system, economic abuse was seen, but in terms of evidence, it was sidelined in the prosecution itself. And we're going to explore and unpack a little bit of what that means as we move forward. But the research as a whole looked at how economic abuse is reflected and responded to within successful prosecutions of the controlling or coercive behaviour offence, the CCB offence, which we often refer to it in shorthand, that Ruth described. So I'm just going to start with a little bit of background about this research and where it came from. It actually builds on some research that we undertook back in 2017, when the charity had just been founded, and we wanted to demonstrate that economic abuse was a thing and that government should do something about it. And in late December 2015, the offence of controlling or coercive behaviour had come into effect. And what we did was look across media reports to see if we could find successful prosecutions of that offence and to see how much of that coercive and controlling behaviour that was reflected within the prosecutions included behaviours which reflected economic control or economic abuse. And we found then that 60% of cases did indeed include elements of economic control. So we were able to use that as an example of economic abuse happening within the context of domestic abuse. We looked at that research and analysed it in relation to what those behaviours actually look like in practice. We have a definition around economic abuse, which is how an abuser interferes with a victim's ability to acquire, use and maintain their economic resources. And as we go through the presentation, we'll be talking about what some of those tactics look like that do stop that survivor from both acquiring, using and maintaining their economic resources. And I think Ruth, in fact, has already provided a great illustration of what that looks like in practice. And of course, it's also very important to recognise that this is a component of coercive and controlling behaviour more broadly. So to that piece about challenging that control of your economic resources, you know, we know for a lot of victims and survivors, this will be happening alongside emotional abuse and physical and sexual violence, which could escalate, as we know, to homicide for lots of victims and survivors if that control is challenged. So very important to remember the context within which this is happening. So just to give you a couple of examples, I guess, of what came out of that research back in 2017 and the groundwork that we'd kind of laid ahead of this research is that we made 6 recommendations in that 2017 report. The first was that statutory guidance on controlling or coercive behaviour should name and define economic abuse, because up until that point it didn't. We worked with parliamentarians in the House of Lords so that when the Domestic Abuse Act was going through Parliament, when it was the bill, we actually worked with them to create an amendment to Section 74 of the Serious Crime Act, which makes coercive controlling behaviour a criminal offence. At that time, it only referred or only applied in cases where somebody was still living with the abuser. And that amendment enabled us to create a change so that post-separation abuse became a criminal offence. And so as a consequence of that amendment, the coercive controlling behaviour statutory guidance was updated, and it now both names economic abuse and gives great examples of it. So certainly it's something now that people in statutory agencies are aware of and are looking for. We also recommended that the Westminster government should recognise economic abuse within the statutory definition of domestic violence that was being developed within what was back then called the Domestic Violence and Abuse Bill. And again, we were successful with that call so that economic abuse is both named and defined within what then became known as the Domestic Abuse Act of 2021. We also recommended that consideration should be given about how to address forms of economic abuse which result in economic costs to the victim in sentencing. and possibly criminal injury claims. And in 2018, new sentencing guidelines introduced a new aggravating factor of victim left in debt, destitution or homelessness due to an exploitation of finances. And you'll see the significance of that as the presentation continues. And the other recommendations are things that we continue to work on. And so I'll just leave them there because I'm sure you will receive a copy of this presentation. So I shall hand over to Catherine, who's going to talk a little bit more about the present study.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And yeah, so since Into Plain Sight was first published in 2017, we've continued to monitor and collect information on those successful prosecutions of control and coercive behaviour. So it's been a long time in the making, this report, but I'm really pleased to be here today and that we can share some of our findings from the first 7 years of control and coercive behaviour offence and what that looked like. So that builds on the first report. We've incorporated the cases that we found in the first report, so this one includes a full picture of those first 7 years up until the end of 2022. To give a very brief overview of how we did the research, we used searches on Google, Twitter, and a news database called LexisNexis, using search terms which included various phrases around coercive control and which also used police force areas. So we found, using those methods, we found a total of 810 successful prosecutions from when the offence first came into effect at the end of 2015 right through to the end of 2022. So these were media reports of the court cases and the trials and convictions. So they were quite often from local newspapers. So we logged information about each of these cases that we came across, so information like the date, the location, any other charges or convictions that were featured alongside the events of control and coercive behaviour, information about the victim and the perpetrator, depending on what was included in the news report, if the perpetrator had pleaded guilty or pleaded not guilty, kind of any information that was available about the sentence. And of course, if examples of economic abuse were reported. And we analysed details of those cases both quantitatively and qualitatively. In addition to the media coverage analysis, we also conducted interviews with 4 victim survivors who had been through a successful prosecution for control and coercive behaviour. And we're really, really grateful to them for taking part in the research and kind of bringing some of that victim survivor voice really strongly into the research. So a huge thank you to those 4 women. And of course, there are limitations to the research. The kind of main one is that we were only able to include cases which received some media coverage and which resulted in a conviction for coercive control. So we don't know how representative the cases in our sample are of coercive control convictions more generally. The information in each of the media reports could also vary quite a lot, so we didn't always necessarily have the same details across each case. And we know that economic abuse will kind of have also occurred in more of these cases than we've been able to say, purely because of what was kind of reported, what was presented as evidence as well in the cases. And this is demonstrated really strongly by one of the victim survivors that we spoke to and we interviewed. She shared her experiences of economic abuse in the interview, but this wasn't actually mentioned in the media coverage that we came across of her case. And also generally, we don't know how the cases in our sample kind of compare to unsuccessful prosecutions for control and coercive behaviour. But positively, we know we've got a really good sample size, and yeah, we've been able to kind of do a lot of analysis with the sample size and the cases that we have. And so moving on when the slides change, which there we go. So overall, 64% of the 810 media cases, media reports that we came across included descriptions of economically abusive behaviours. Most of the convictions we found were related to intimate partner violence. So 85% of cases involved intimate partners, 4% involved adult family members, and kind of the rest are unknown, kind of going back to that limitation I said of not all the media reports kind of included the same level of detail. But looking at what we know about perpetrators in these cases, across both the intimate partner and the adult family violence cases, 98% of the perpetrators were male, and the mean age of perpetrators was 34. If we look only at the intimate partner violence cases, 99% of the perpetrators were men. And in just the adult family violence cases, this was slightly lower, where 91% of the perpetrators were men. And looking at victim survivors, again, across all the cases, 94% of the victim survivors were female, 1% were male, and another 1% of cases involved both male and female victim survivors. The mean age of victim survivors was 31. And then when we look at only the intimate partner violence cases, 96% of victim survivors were female. But in the adult family violence cases, this fell, so this was just 69%, and then a further 11% of adult family violence victims were male, and 17% involved both men and women as victim survivors. The mean age was also higher for victim survivors in adult family violence cases, kind of reflecting that many of these situations involved an adult child who was abusing either their parent or their grandparent. And to give a kind of overview of the sort of bigger picture around the convictions that we found and came across, less than 1/3 of perpetrators were prosecuted only for controlling or coercive behaviour. So 2/3 included at least one other offence. So just over half involved offences around physical violence, such as ABH or GBH. 10% included criminal damage or property damage, though this did rise slightly when we looked at only at the cases which involved economic abuse. 8% of the cases included offences around threatening behaviour or causing fear or serious distress and threats to life to the victim. Another 8% of cases included charges of rape or sexual assault. And one case included a charge of manslaughter, and in another case, the coroner's inquest found that the victim had been unlawfully killed after she died by suicide. And then when it came to the pleas and sentences across the full 810 cases, 73% of perpetrators pled guilty. This was slightly higher in the cases which included examples of economic abuse. 3/4 of perpetrators received a custodial prison sentence, and the mean sentence length was 23 months. The offence can carry a sentence of up to 5 years, so this kind of shows that's quite a bit less than that. 15% of perpetrators received a suspended sentence, and these often included community orders or attending a programme like the Building Better Relationships Perpetrator Programme or Drug and Alcohol Use Programme. And 50% of perpetrators received a restraining order, with the average length being 6.5 years, although 28% of the restraining orders in our sample were indefinite or lifetime orders. And back over to you, Nick.
Thank you. So I think what was really striking for us was the media coverage suggested that victims and survivors did not call the police reporting economic abuse. They called the police reporting an emergency, and quite often that emergency was a threat to their life. We also found, and this came out as a real theme within the interviews as well, and certainly for Ruth, was that actually lots of the people who called the police didn't actually recognise their experiences as including economic abuse until after reporting. So there's a quote here, and I can also talk to Ruth's experience when we interviewed her, was that it wasn't until she was given some information about controlling or coercive behaviour that she even knew that it existed as an offence. Again, you know, she called because her children were in fear for her life if she came home that night. She was kind of able to tick all those behaviours, and that is when she became aware of economic abuse, but that wasn't the reason why she had called the police. So really important piece here around awareness raising, because we want cases to stop escalating to the level of fear for life before victims and survivors report either to the police or to an employer or to anybody else.
And looking at the different kind of resources that perpetrators targeted, these really varied hugely into victim survivors' employment, which I know Nick's going to come back to, their education as well, their home, their means of transport, their utilities, personal belongings, including, you know, sentimental items which couldn't be replaced, and things that they needed to kind of meet personal needs as well, like wheelchairs or glasses. And the report really highlighted, and the research findings really highlighted just how coercive control threaded through economic abuse and overlapped with other forms of abuse, like physical abuse, like sexual violence. And you can see that in the kind of other charges and convictions that were alongside the coercive control and offence. And there was also evidence about perpetrators really personalising the abuse to victim survivors' kind of individual identities. For example, using racist or ableist language, you know, mocking victim survivors who didn't speak English, denying religious divorces as well. So really kind of targeting what would cause the most distress and harm for that particular victim survivor. But there were also examples of resistance from victim survivors in the media coverage. So this included victim survivors hiding their bank cards or money, or freezing their account, or kind of blaming technical problems on why they couldn't transfer money to a perpetrator. And then Nick, I think this is back over to you.
Yeah, so I think that kind of list of all the economic resources that perpetrators sought to control demonstrates the vast array of impacts that this had on victims and survivors. And again, sort of referencing back to the very beginning about the aggregating factors within the sentencing guidelines around here, around debt, destitution, homelessness, you can really see these are the impacts that economic abuse does have on victims and survivors. So, you know, poverty, loss of possession, jobs, the ability to advance, being left in debt or with a poor credit score. And again, Ruth spoke really strongly to that, I believe. So this for us highlights the need for victims and survivors, as I said, first of all, to recognise economic abuse, and for those of us in this area to be able to recognise it ourselves, to be able to support victims and survivors and have conversations with them about it, and then to ensure they have access to specialist advocacy to re-establish their economic safety. What I would say is, if you're thinking, gosh, well, maybe economic safety is not, you know, as serious, perhaps, you know, as demonstrated through lesser prison sentences, we would really argue that economic safety underpins physical safety. Again, Ruth spoke about how, you know, she wasn't able to leave because she didn't have the resources to do so. So victims and survivors who do experience economic abuse generally stay longer than they would want to, experience more harm as a consequence, and actually at more risk of homicide as well. So really important that we are recognising, as I say, and responding to economic abuse really early. Also, just to flag as well, because of that kind of lack of recognition within the criminal justice system around economic abuse, because that wasn't always then incorporated into the actual prosecution, the focus was on other forms of abuse within that coercive controlling behaviour context. Victims and survivors felt a real sense of injustice because not all their experiences were being recognised within the court process. So it's very difficult to kind of condense all the victim testimony within this presentation, and I would really recommend people reading the chapter in the report that does explore how victims and survivors' economic resources were controlled more broadly. But just to give you a few ideas and to think about from an employer perspective around economic abuse particularly, we found that the targeting of victim survivors' employment was kind of by far the largest kind of category of economic abuse that we saw. So we saw different tactics. So when I talked at the beginning about behaviours, we generally see these as being three broad strategies. So restriction, which again, Ruth spoke to really strongly. So perhaps refusing to let a victim survivor go to work, but if they do, not letting them have their wages, which is a form of exploitation. That could be through using physical abuse or restraint, suggesting that a victim survivor who might have gone off on maternity leave doesn't go back because they wouldn't be a good parent, perhaps to work and parent at the same time, but also doing things that stop them perhaps from earning overtime or advancing their careers, so reducing their hours or forbidding them from working late or doing overtime, and also restricting access to the things that they needed to have for work. So for example, transport to get to work. So examples of car keys being stolen or dropped down drains and things like that. We also saw a huge amount of sabotage. And this is where I would say that a lot of people do think about economic abuse as mostly restriction and mostly dependency, but actually we see a lot of victims and survivors who have complete control of the economic resources, or complete control in terms of being able to do things that enable them to get economic resources, but not control about how those economic resources are used. So perhaps seeing a lot of sabotage, which means that they're constantly having to replace resources. They might be being exploited through the perpetrator taking out debt in their name. So lots of things that don't make them dependent on the abuser, but create such economic instability that they still can't make the decisions that they want to, because they're just trying to survive on the means that they have. So we saw abusers contacting employers to tell the victim survivor, to tell them that the victim survivor had either quit or manipulated them into giving up their jobs, damaging or destroying the resources they needed to work. So that could be a uniform, work clothes, a laptop, a mobile phone, making false accusations against the victim survivor, which led them to lose their job, interfering with job applications or interviews to stop them getting from jobs in the first place. Other examples included, if we get to the next slide, so I can continue, thank you. Stopping the victim from sleeping, for example, so their performance was poor and therefore they lost their job from that reason. Going to the victim survivor's workplace whilst they were on a break and demanding they come home, or otherwise harassing colleagues, sending abusive messages to managers, all things that either led to the victim survivor losing their job or feeling like they had to resign because of the embarrassment and the stigma and the shame that they were experiencing. In retail or sort of service spaces, also confronting customers and becoming aggressive, and also just constantly contacting the victim survivor during the day, almost making it impossible for them to perform their job. So we do make a number of recommendations within the report, but we wanted to focus on the one that was specific to employers because of the context that we're in today. And I think certainly in terms of our recommendations to the Westminster government, we really want them to increase their efforts to develop partnership working, both with bodies engaged with employers, such as EIDA, or in other ways, and to always think about economic abuse when doing that work. It can be one of those early warning signs of coercive controlling behaviour more broadly, alongside emotional abuse. And as I said, if we can recognise this form of abuse really early on, we can stop cases escalating. So finally, just very quickly, and we'll come back to this after the Q&As, as Susan said, we do work with domestic abuse charities to help them think about economic abuse within that context of domestic abuse more broadly, and to support training around how employers can recognise economic abuse. So for example, just one thing that you could do really quickly as an employer would be to look at your payroll and just to check that everybody who works for you is actually having their wages paid into an account in their name. That could be an immediate flag to people who perhaps are having wages paid into a different account, and certainly some employers we know won't pay into a joint account, and they help support a victim survivor's independence by insisting that it is a named account for the victim survivor only. But we also have resources on our website, certainly because of particular risks at certain times. So we do know that domestic abuse generally either starts or increases during pregnancy. This is a good time to have conversations around economic safety, because people will be going off work, they won't have access necessarily to their full income during that time, and you can start to kind of ask gentle questions around, you know, whether conversations have been had about finances at home and how that will be managed and how childcare will be paid for, all things that might be able to give you a bit of a heads up in terms of answers that might suggest that one partner is controlling the other. And we've also looked at different life stages as well, which sits within a report that we've written around 6 moments that matter for employers, which, as I said, looks at the life course more generally, and other resources more generally. So how victims and survivors can access economic resources, so access to money, benefits, other resources that they need, and also as an employer, but also as a friend, a colleague, a family member, how you might support someone and how you might recognise the specific warning signs of economic abuse, which we've worked alongside victims and survivors to develop. So they're very specific to economic abuse and their experiences. And we're also going to make a bit of a plea for you to help us share our banking support directory, which we're going to share some information on a little bit later in the webinar. But just knowing what resources are out there for victims and survivors to access, is also really key in helping them to re-establish either that economic independence or to recreate the stability that's so important.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much for sharing that summary of the report. And I really do commend it to people, particularly in order to raise awareness about reading the chapter about people's different experiences, because I think that really it's quite a tough read, but it really brings it alive in terms of the specific behaviours that people are subjected to, and can help you think through, well, how do we respond as an employer? So we're going to move on to some questions, and just to encourage everybody, do please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box. Some are coming up in the chat. We'll try and pick those up as well, but if you could put them in the Q&A box, that would be particularly helpful. Thank you very much. But just to start off, I was, I'm really struck by the fact that in nearly 2/3 of these 810 cases that were reported in the press, there was a reference to economic abuse, but the courts in practice seem to be much more focused on cases that involve physical abuse, physical violence. And I often hear anecdotally, and it comes through your report, that there will often be plea bargaining and it will end up with somebody being convicted, possibly, but for the physical violence rather than for the coercive controlling behaviour and the economic abuse. And this, as you said, leaves people with this feeling of unfairness. Do you have any perspective on why that is still the case in court cases at the moment?
Yeah, so we know that some of the victim survivors that we interviewed spoke about thinking of that full journey of the criminal justice system. They spoke about that the police weren't particularly interested in kind of their evidence that they had around economic abuse. So, for example, there's Ruth speaks about in the report that she had bags and bags of paperwork that were relating to the economic abuse, but the police who were kind of doing that investigating work were much more kind of interested in the kind of other charges that were alongside. And said that they felt that including the information on the economic abuse would actually detract from those other charges. So we know that that's a really huge barrier in terms of what information then makes it into the court case, and becomes part of the conviction. Nick, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
I think there's also something about the skill set, because actually the police can do some great work in the economic crime space, but we talk to police forces who we would never think to bring economic crime specialists into the domestic abuse space. They haven't got time necessarily to sift through lots of bank statements, which might demonstrate and evidence economic abuse. But just something that's really powerful, I mention it because it really was in the headlines last week, was the mother of a victim survivor who took their own life, went into the property afterwards and found the bank statements, and actually saw that the perpetrator had been paying 10p a go into the victim survivor's bank account post-separation, and with each payment was spelling out, using terms to spell out abuse and threats and things like that. So actually, just a quick glance at something like that would actually demonstrate, fear, intimidation, ongoing threats, post-separation abuse. So there's lots more we feel that the police could do to think about how they evidence this form of abuse specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's possibly something to do with the ease of getting a conviction, and there may be easier ways, as you say, than going through all of that, sifting through all of that evidence. But one of the consequences of it is, as Ruth described so clearly to all of us, was that somebody is then left at the end, without a home, without the ability to get a mortgage, without the ability even to rent somewhere, without her parents acting as guarantors, and so you've lost that safety, that financial safety, and so on. And I was again very struck by the fact that your findings that only 2% of the cases actually resulted in the perpetrator of the abuse being required to pay compensation to the survivor. Again, maybe this is a matter of, education and time, but do you have any thoughts on how those sorts of compensation orders or other ways that people could get their assets back, if you like, could become more common?
Well, I think, again, this was just reflective of the fact that the investigation didn't evidence economic abuse. So the case heard in court didn't make reference to economic abuse. Therefore, the economic impacts of the abuse weren't explored. So when it came to sentencing, first of all, the aggravating factor that we talked about wasn't taken into account because examples of homelessness, destitution, debt hadn't been discussed. And therefore, as you say, Susan, compensation orders weren't made because there wasn't a recognition of the economic impact on the victim and survivor. So certainly something in Canada that we're quite keen to explore, because it does kind of address that in many ways, are things called restitution orders, where, if we are looking at economic abuse across the piece, actually victims can be compensated for kind of loss of earnings, certainly, which would be important from an employment perspective, but also to address credit ratings. So certainly in Canada, if you can prove this has happened, then the credit rating can be restored to what it was before the victim or survivor experienced that abuse. So at the minute, credit scores of victims and survivors purely reflect their abuse and not their behaviour, which is the point of a credit score ultimately. And again, really interestingly, again, as part of evidencing economic abuse, is if you look at a credit score, you'll generally see it's very good before the victim meets the perpetrator, crashes whilst they're with them, and then tends to improve afterwards, because the victim survivor recognises that in order to move forward and to rebuild their life, they do need to rebuild their credit. So whilst there are ways of doing that at the minute through things like kind of correction notices and things on like credit reports, it requires every creditor to kind of contact the credit reference agency to agree those corrections, and creditors don't always look at those credit reports and the detail anyway that would explain why someone's credit rating wasn't very good. So there's a huge amount that could be done in that space. And it also just demonstrates, again, until we get there, the importance of employers, being really supportive of victims and survivors, giving them paid leave, ensuring that they're not using all their annual leave, for example, on going through a court case, which could take, weeks, thinking about how they can support them to access economic resources. That might be helping them pay for legal advice, for example, in terms of maybe civil or family court actions which are happening alongside the criminal justice system. There are so many ways an employer could support the economic well-being of a victim survivor during that time as well. Both during the prosecution, but also, in the lead up to and in the aftermath of as well. Again, Catherine, sorry, I don't know if you'd add. I felt like I went on for quite a while there.
No, I think you've covered everything that I was thinking of. But like you said, and like the victim survivors in there who we interviewed spoke to, is just the impacts can be so long lasting, and there's just a real sense of injustice that they have to deal with these long-lasting unfair impacts of the perpetrator's behaviours.
So stepping back and thinking from an employer's perspective, how do you, as a line manager, for example, managing your team, how might you spot signs of economic abuse really practically? Because it's well known that survivors of victims and survivors of economic abuse are often very good at really hiding what's going on, don't really want to share. That can be incredibly difficult. So obviously creating a culture in a workplace where people do feel able to come forward knowing that they will be listened to and that they will be supported is hugely important. But as a line manager listening to this today, what should they, we've talked a little bit about it, but what sort of things should they really be looking out for? What sort of red flags might you point them to?
So one thing would be changes in appearances. So certainly victim survivors might be prevented from buying new clothes, colouring their hair, having haircuts. They might lose a lot of weight because their access to food might be also controlled. They might be very tired because they're being kept up all night. Their work equipment might be damaged regularly because the perpetrator is seeking to stop them from working, or to perhaps sabotage their employment more generally. They might make excuses in terms of, going out and doing social things at lunchtime because they can't afford to do that. They might perhaps say that they've left their purse or wallet at home, for example. They might not do things after work. They might talk about having financial difficulties, and if they're paid well, then again that could be a bit of an alarm bell as to why they're experiencing financial difficulties. And as we said, there are sort of key moments through conversations maybe linked to maternity leave or other things, where things might be said that would just not sit quite right. Again, we know victims and survivors are quite often waiting for someone to ask them the question, and you can ask questions and probe gently without suggesting that someone is being abused. But certainly we know that the victims and survivors we spoke to, really wished an employer or a colleague, had said something to them.
So also embedding those sorts of questions perhaps into your, standard questions that somebody might ask at a time of maternity or in an annual appraisal or something like that. So it becomes part of the way that you do things around here, rather than relying on having a manager who's particularly attuned to it. I think
we'd like economic safety to be discussed in the same way as mental health is discussed.
Yeah.
That's become more of a normal conversation, and society, we don't really talk about finances. It's kind of wrong in some ways, but if we could make it as open to have those conversations, that would be a really positive thing.
And I think just being aware of the person that you're employing and your colleague, the changes in behaviour. So if someone normally is really up for kind of going out for drinks after work or doing something at lunchtime but then suddenly can't, or if their partner is always picking them up from work or always taking them to work, kind of maybe asking if everything's okay, and it's like changes in their behaviour from kind of how they might have been at a different time.
And that constant interruption piece, the phone constantly going or emails keep pinging in, and the victim survivor having to step out of the office, constantly having to describe where they are and what they're doing to the abuser, things like that too.
But that's really helpful, and I think that's responded to one or two of the questions that I'm seeing in the chat about the best way for a manager to approach an employee and so forth. So that's some really practical, helpful guidance. Thank you. I'm sort of now trying to coordinate between the chat and the Q&A. So I'm going to turn now and ask some of the questions that I'm starting to see pop up. So one interesting question is: were there any cultural patterns in the cases that you reviewed? Were there groups of people missing who may be less able to access support, I suppose, and therefore those cases may not be coming forward or may not be reported?
It was quite difficult to tell because, as Catherine said, the information was very limited in terms of the newspaper reports. So we were kind of able to pick up on clues along the way. And certainly, some sort of cultural patterns were around those convictions that included multiple perpetrators, so a partner and also family members as well. Unfortunately, as we say, the reporting just didn't go into the level of detail that it needed to. Certainly one of the interviewees spoke a little bit to her specific experience as an Indian woman. So I think one of the other recommendations that we put forward within the report is to understand more about the needs of different groups of individuals, and also how people have multiple identities, intersecting inequalities, which come together to create that kind of personalisation that Catherine talked to, and which we saw clues in relation to, but there wasn't enough for us to say anything specifically.
There's a question around housing. What's your advice to victim survivors who live in a house in the name of the person who is abusing them, or in this case they're actually saying abusive spouse? The abusive partner will often ask the victim to leave the house knowing that they don't have anywhere else to live. What are the marital rights there? Is that something either of you is able to comment on? It goes on to talk about land registry requiring the victim to have registered the right officially, and so forth, and this being a big risk to victims and survivors.
you know, it's certainly a really complex area, and we hear all the time of victims and survivors, you know, being ejected out of the house, you know, this is not in your name, you don't pay towards it, you know, you shouldn't be here. So it's a very common tactic, but it's complex because your rights vary, certainly if you have a mortgaged property in relation to whether you're married or not married as well. So we've got a huge amount of resources on our website around this specifically. So I would refer people to look at that, because the detail, you know, there is a lot of detail and differences, and also myths and misconceptions as well, which are really sort of worth exploring. So I would refer people to the website on that one.
Okay, that's brilliant. And afterwards, as well as sending around the slides and so forth, we will also put together some links for people so that they can go and find more detail for specific questions. So the next one is from someone who works in the public sector and has found that many local authorities signpost to your fantastic charity for help and resources on economic abuse. Do you have any practical tips for things that local councils should be doing to address economic abuse? The person putting the question says, I welcome and very much appreciate signposting the amazing work your charity does, but can't help but feel that local authorities could be doing more in this specific realm, as they do for generalised domestic abuse.
Yeah, so we do training for local authorities on economic abuse. We provide that, which kind of explores how local authorities can be kind of responding, being aware of economic abuse, spotting those signs, and kind of helping support victim survivors, which is would probably be a great starting point to kind of help with that.
It's also just worth remembering local authorities also deal with money. They'll have income teams, so in relation to housing, council tax, sort of other financial matters. And we have worked with the Cabinet Office to create a toolkit for the public sector on how they can respond to economic abuse. So we kind of recommend them to have a look at that. And again, certainly something, and we're sort of looking for local authorities to get involved. So I'll use this as a plug, is that we're piloting something called the Economic Abuse Evidence Form. So this is where victims and survivors have been coerced into debt. We know from our other work, again, this is really, you know, our findings in this space are so underreported, because we know the vast majority of victims and survivors never go near the criminal justice system anyway. But we know more generally that 95% of domestic abuse survivors will experience economic abuse, and of those 60% will be coerced into debt. We also know on average that victims and survivors will have 5 to 7 different creditors, which will include public authorities as well. And the average debt, certainly going into the global pandemic around COVID, was just under £6,000. Our most recent data for the last quarter was that the average debt of a victim survivor is now £27,000. So we are finding a way through this form to demonstrate that economic abuse has happened to creditors, so they don't have to spend a lot of time working that out themselves. And then asking for solutions to victims and survivors. And in some cases that includes debt write-off, which then enables the victim survivor, again, you know, to not have to spend the next decade paying back money, if not longer, on, you know, loans and credit cards and things, again, you know, that Ruth referred to, which they never, you know, saw a benefit from. So any local authorities out there who would like to join us for the Economic Abuse Evidence Form pilot, we would be really happy to hear from.
Great, thank you. There's one question, do you find evidence of victims also being coerced to work more hours or pushing for pay increases to earn more money, to be obviously taken by the perpetrator of the abuse, rather than preventing them from going to work? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We came across that in this research. We also last year published a review of literature, global literature on economic abuse, so kind of really trying to capture everything that was kind of known about economic abuse, which is available on our website. And again, that's, you know, found a significant amount of evidence internationally about how perpetrators were kind of able to interfere with, exploit, sabotage, restrict victim survivors' employment. And one of those was, you know, forcing victim survivors to work overtime, to work multiple jobs, you know, to work so many hours of the day that they barely had time to sleep. But yeah, taking their wages, making sure they didn't have access to those. Yeah, there was a significant amount of evidence kind of looking exactly at that. Yeah.
Yeah, so either stopping somebody from work or encouraging them to, and then taking the proceeds.
Yeah, absolutely. And also encouraging or forcing victim survivors to work in family businesses, and then kind of not paying for them, but expecting them to work, you know, horrendously long hours, but and profiting off that without the victim survivor kind of seeing any of that income.
I'll also just mention, because we just see more and more of it, where victim survivors have no choice but to work all hours. So this is where a partner refuses to contribute to household costs, so they have their own job, but they don't, you know, use any of their own income to support the household. They just spend their money how they would like to, but then demand a certain living standard. So victims and survivors are either having to work all hours to meet that, or go into debt themselves in order to please and appease the abuser. So they have no choice but to work all of those hours because of the repercussions if they don't provide what the perpetrator wants.
And as an employer, when somebody comes forward and says, look, this is what's happening to me, you know, as well as listening and providing, you know, practical support for that individual within the workplace, where should employers be signposting people? To you? Are there other organisations or information that employers should know about and be able to signpost their employees to?
I think we've touched on the role of banks as being hugely important here, and something else I would say to people who also are in a business that does provide goods or services is that this is something your customers will be experiencing too. And if you want to be able to respond to vulnerable customers, and economic abuse survivors do sit within that group now, you can't expect your staff, your colleagues, to provide support to customers without, as an employer yourself, providing support to your staff. So, you know, knowing about the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, knowing about domestic abuse charities, charities that support, you know, people from particular backgrounds who kind of really understand their experiences. You know, economic abuse is just one small part of all of these things. But, you know, something that we've been able to do, and which is why we wanted to talk about our banking directory, was because actually banks and building societies are doing great things now, which they weren't doing back in 2017. So they now have a financial abuse code, which sets out a number of principles around how they should respond. So that does include training your HR team to support your colleagues, your staff, as well as to support your customers more generally. And they will do things, you know, like TSB is very public about actually having a flea fund for victims and survivors. I mean, again, interest-free loans or grants are things that employers can provide, you know, support around hotels. You know, this is everybody coming together and saying, how can we support the victims, survivors' economic well-being? But certainly alongside employers, you know, banks as employers for colleagues, but banks as employers for banks as people who have customers are doing a huge amount in this space, which is just incredible. You know, they will remove someone from a joint account. They never used to do that. They'll accept a PO box number for a refuge. They never used to do that. They'll create a bank card that has no sort code on it, so that the victim survivor can't be traced to a particular location within the country. You know, it's fantastic what banks are doing, and part of our banking directory, to my point about how every victim survivor who certainly is in debt has 5 to 7 different creditors. You know, we have multiple financial products as individuals, so you can imagine how much time it takes to work out what your bank or your building society or plural will do for you. So the banking directory pulls that information into one place and enables you to access that from our website.
That's a brilliant segue. So just to finish up, if we could play the short trailer video about the directory, which is going to be launched later in this next month in November, just so people can have a flavour of what it is, and then we will be encouraging employers to know about it and be able to signpost their people to it. So could we play that video, please?
Hi, my name's Lauren and I'm the Financial Services Manager at Surviving Economic Abuse. It's my absolute pleasure to be able to share information with you today about the launch of SEA's Directory of Banking Support. This directory is a one-stop shop for survivors of domestic and economic abuse to be able to access information about the support that their financial services provider can offer. Disclosing domestic and economic abuse isn't easy, and we know it can be re-traumatizing to repeat a story of abuse multiple times. We also know that survivors are more likely to disclose that they've experienced a form of abuse to a financial service provider
Catherine,
than they are to the police or a frontline domestic abuse service.
The
And this
noise
shows
a bit glitchy, and what we'll do is we'll send it round to everybody, if that's okay, Nick, afterwards, and people can just watch it. So sorry, yes, the sound quality was, we practiced it earlier and it was all very clear, but that was quite quite glitchy, somebody said. So we'll send that around, but we'll provide more information about that directory, because I think it's going to be a fantastic way that employers can support people by pointing them to this collection of the real support that their banks, building societies now can offer to people who are victims and survivors of economic abuse. So with that, I'm afraid to say that we are coming to the end of our time. There's lots of really great comments, thank you, in the chat. We'll go through in our usual way and create a 1 to 2 page key points for employers coming out of today's discussion, along with lots of links to useful information. And so it remains to me to say a massive thank you to Nicola Sharp-Jeffs and to Catherine Royal for joining us today, and more importantly for doing your fantastic work, and particularly on this most recent report and for the upcoming directory. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to all our audience for joining. And just to let everybody know that our next Insight Hour will be next month in November on the 21st. Usual time between 1 and 2, where we will be focusing on the Bright Sky app, which is a really important tool that employers can use as part of their overall response to domestic abuse. So with that, thank you, everybody, and see you next time.